Hello and welcome back to Epistem. Today we're going to be looking at a paper. It is actually a review article over MOF water harvesters. So MOF stands for Metal Organic Frameworks. Hunter will be going a little bit more into that. But this is actually the first article in a series that we're planning on doing that's going to be going over sustainability and research that's going into those fields. So that should be pretty cool. Stay tuned for that. We've got some interviews with entrepreneurs and we're planning to interview some professors and researchers on the subject, so that should be pretty interesting. Hope you enjoy.
I'm Hunter.
And I'm Luke, and you're listening to Epistem, a show where we explore papers in STEM fields and let you know what they're all about.
So as Luke already stated, the title of this review article is MOF Water Harvesters. The researchers who did this are Nikita Haniko, Matthew Prévost, and Omar Yagi. The review article is published in Nature Nanotechnology, Volume 15, in May 2020. And from here, let's talk about the abstract of the article itself.
Let's do it.
So, in essence, they talk about the creation of more methods to generate fresh water and how imperative that is to address the global water shortage. Utilizing MOFs, metal organic frameworks, they can help to harvest water from air even in very dry places. The researchers wanted to push the MOF field as a viable route to freshwater generation in the future. According to the Department of Chemistry at University of California, more than half of the world's population suffers from water stress, and that number is expected to rise in the coming years. Water stress is when the demand for clean water exceeds the supply available. The researchers wanted to work to achieve more sustainable water generation methods that can be used globally. There are three main ways that they can generate water from atmospheric means, and the first is fog collection by using large nets. The second is cooling air below its dew point, and the third is sorbent assisted water capture. Fog collection by using large nets is inexpensive and low maintenance. However, it requires a foggy region, so it can only be used in mountainous and coastal regions. Cooling air below its dew point can be used in a wide range of areas, but the efficiency and productivity really depend on the region that it occurs in. The air needs to be cooled below the dew point to remove associated sensible heat, which is energy required to cool the air. While that occurs, there is also latent heat, which needs to be dissipated, and this is the heat that is let off during condensation. Latent heat primarily stays the same in different climates. However, sensible heat changes a lot depending on the climate. Dry and arid places will require more sensible heat, thus more energy to condense compared to wet and tropical areas. That would mean that this is not a totally viable option, especially in dry and arid places, because it would be costly and not energy efficient. The sorbent assisted water harvesting is what this research mostly focuses on. It involves using a desiccant to absorb or adsorb the atmospheric water, then apply pressure or temperature to release the water vapor from the sorbent. The researchers favor using low-grade energy or waste heat created from another process to release this vapor.
So is this kind of like a sponge on a micro level?
Correct. It's actually a good example of a sorbent like this is when you open up a pack of beef jerky, the silica gel or the silica beads in the bottom of that, those are sorbents. They take out all the moisture within the bag and allow you to have dried meats or dried goods, whatever they're in.
Like a humidity control.
Correct. The researchers found this to be the most viable option of the three due to its geographic versatility. The research I'm going to discuss will continue to look into methods of using sorbent-assisted water harvesting and finding viable sorbents. The researchers came up with 4 criteria for a good sorbent to use. The first one is maintain water capacity after a multitude of water uptake and release cycles. So this involves being able to use the water sorbent many times without it being overused or just being somewhat corrupted. The second criteria is exhibit a high water sorption working capacity under operational conditions. They would prefer step-shaped isotherms with negligible hysteresis, and in simpler terms, this means that they want a substance that has a uniform or consistent change when pressure or heat are applied. Negligible hysteresis means that there isn't much variance in the area or change under the heat to pressure curve. Having this allows for the release of water to be easy by using smaller changes of temperature or pressure within the system. A good example of a hysteresis change, for those that don't know, is an air conditioning unit. So an air conditioning unit will do tests to monitor how high and how low the temperatures are going. So if the temperature hits a low point, it will start to rise and continue on until it hits whatever the high point is that's set, and then continue that cycle of going between the high point and the low point, creating a difference between temperature over time on a graph. And that's the area that we're looking at between the temperature and time.
So in that example, this would be, say, like you said, an AC to like 65 degrees or 70 degrees or something. It's difficult for it to hold that exact temperature, so it kind of has like an upper and lower limit that it's shifting between.
Correct.
That's the cycle you're talking about.
Correct. It's fluctuating between the two, and with that fluctuation, that creates the graph. The third criteria for good sorbent that they were looking at is have a low regeneration temperature. So this means that it has a low temperature that they remove the water molecule from. Thus, they can remove the water easier than having a high temperature.
And that's for the sake of saving energy, I suppose?
Exactly. The fourth criteria for a good sorbent that they were talking about is possessing a desirable dynamic water sorption properties. So this just involves having the right properties that will vary between different climates and different geographic locations.
So this technology is concerned with getting water out of the air, which is kind of crazy sounding, but it's really the technology is all around you. You think about something like cigars. They have to control the humidity in rooms where there are cigars kept. It's the same with really high-end acoustic instruments like nice guitars or orchestral instruments. You find humidifiers there, or humidifiers you can put into the sound hole of a guitar to keep the inside of the guitar at the right humidity level. There's also things that you can hang in your closet or a safe to keep moisture out of the air in there. So humidity control is very much a technology that's been around for a while. And this is basically just taking it a step further, which would be trying to get drinkable water just straight from the air in a realistic and viable way.
Yeah. So getting into it, MOFs are then talked about in the paper. I'm going to talk about some other methods that they looked into. Besides MOFs, I'll talk about those in the nerd notes, but we'll just get right into it and talk about the entree right here. So MOFs are made from SBUs, which are secondary building units, and those are linked by organic molecules that they refer to as links or chains. Due to the versatility of secondary building units, MOFs can be chemically and structurally changed for various purposes, meaning that they could be used in many different climates if tuned correctly. MOFs has something called isoreticular expansion. This means that they can be reused with different length chains, thus they can change to have greater water capacity if need be. So if you're in a drier climate, or if you're in just a drier area in general, you can actually lengthen the chains and allow for more water absorption and allow for the MOFs to work better in that area.
Okay. So that raises its capacity to absorb.
Correct. And again, I'll discuss that a little more in the nerd notes. There are some downsides to it, but overall, MOFs are looking fantastic in the way that they can change and absorb to different varying lengths and varying capacities. Currently, some MOF powders are being utilized, and they can be mass-produced, and they've been doing testing on small scales to show their water harvesting abilities. Current devices involve MOF layers set into a condenser box to take in dry air at night, then release water vapor during the day when sunlight is reflected onto the condenser. So think of it as just some air being collected in a box per se, and then during the day the box is heated by sunlight, thus creating the, water vapor in the air to condense, and then they collect that condensation.
So that sounds basically like just controlling the process that makes dew in the morning.
Yeah, it essentially is. So the benefit of using MOF is that it can actually retain a lot of the water, whereas if you're just looking at dew, you lose a lot of the water, and a lot of it gets absorbed or evaporates prior to it being utilized.
Interesting.
The researchers are pushing for more utilization of MOF in the future of water harvesting, and what they're mainly pushing for is large-scale testing and use of MOFs. Some of the proposals that they have for this is changing the geometry of current harvesters to allow for more water collection, monitoring pressure changes with the moisture changing devices, and working on some efficient ways to condense the air.
Let's take a break. And let's get back into it.
So that brings us to the nerd notes of this episode. It was shorter main content of this episode, but I have a lot of nerd notes to bring up because there was some very in-depth and cool research that was brought to light in this research article. I want to talk about a couple of the other options that they were researching prior to looking into MOFs. Lithium chloride and calcium chloride were both tested, however they like to deliquesce, i.e. they become liquid when they absorb moisture. This led to a lot of loss of water because they wouldn't really retain the water very well. Another method that they looked into was concentrated salt. This was also tested, but it required a complicated system to allow it to work, and that would be very costly, especially on a large scale. Some other adsorbents, such as silica beads and zeolites, were looked into, but they do not have hydrothermal stability, so they would not be able to hold the water with heat changes as the MOFs are able to do.
So what would the difference be between adsorb and absorb?
So the difference between an absorbent, such as a sponge, absorbs where it takes in the moisture, and an adsorbent actually pockets the moisture.
So they're still like kind of separate entities. They're just kind of meshed together in an adsorbent, or is that kind of the idea there?
Yeah, more or less. So absorbing is more or less actually taking in the liquid or whatever substance it is, and adsorbing is just creating a thin layer or a pocket around or a little bit inside of the substance.
Like a film around the substance that it's adsorbing?
Yeah, exactly.
Versus like a water in a sponge where it kind of penetrates the whole sponge and becomes part of it.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so moving on, there are many different types of MOFs that can be utilized for a lot of different means. I won't go into all of them, but if any listener wants to look at the extensive list, it's very cool, and they talked about a lot of different kinds with different structures, but it's fantastic to me that they can be utilized for similar means with so many different types and variability.
I'm curious what the capacity is of one of these things. Like, how much water does it make and how quickly does it do it?
MOFs have been known to take in more water than their competitors. However, creating MOFs with high uptakes can lead to more energy being used to condense the water, thus making it less viable in arid regions. If you're looking for exact numbers, they can take up to volumes of about 5 cubic centimeters, which is pretty large for being on a small scale. Like, most of the MOFs are microscopic in a way. MOFs are used in a layering sequence, so they're compounded together. So just a singular MOF is really small, but it would be, when they're being utilized, they're sort of like a blanket being woven together.
So a single one can absorb like 5 cubic centimeters of water.
Correct.
Theoretically.
Correct. And that is that's the highest one that they were sort of stating within this research. I don't know the specifics on different ones, but that's their high uptake version, which is a higher pour rate within the MOS. So then that creates more area for the water to be absorbed. But like I said, it's more energy consuming to actually condense the water from that point. So that's why it's not totally viable, but it could be an option in a very wet area. Another thing I thought was really cool about this research is that there are many tests being done to show that the bonds between the SBU and the linker have hydrolytic stability, which allows MOFs to stay stable when interacting with water at different temperatures and pressures. The last nerd note is about the step-shape isotherm that I talked about earlier. MOFs, in this case MOF 801, create step-shaped isotherms by adsorbing small amounts at low pressures. Then with increasing vapor pressures, they increase their adsorption rates to create a really cool hysteresis interaction. So in essence, that means that they're actually able to control the amount of water they intake based on the pressure of the system they're within.
Interesting. So the vapor pressure, that'd be in most cases like the atmospheric pressure?
Yes, and in the systems that people are trying to make with MOFs, they would be under a controlled pressure in a controlled system, but still utilize atmospheric pressure on top of that. In conclusion, these researchers want MOF studies to continue because they believe with more testing and monitoring of MOF devices, they can become a very usable treatment to water stress.
Well, that's all we got for you this episode. Again, stay tuned if you're interested in this sort of thing. We are planning on doing some more sustainability-related papers and articles, so we're pretty excited about that. Again, this paper was called MOF Water Harvesters. That's just MOF. It was written by Nikita Hanikel, Matthew Privo, and Omar Yagi. This publication can be found in the Nature Nanotechnology Journal, Volume 15, which was released May 2020. If you're interested in giving us some feedback or making a suggestion, you can reach out to us at epistem.pod@gmail.com, or you can hit us up on Instagram at epi.stem, or just search Epistem Podcast. You'll find us. If you're feeling really generous, you can reach out to us on Patreon. Again, that's just patreon.com/epistem. But beyond that, thanks for listening and stay tuned. Stay curious, people.